After weeks of saying the Seahawks were not done upgrading their interior offensive line, John Schneider backed up his words by signing Laken Tomlinson. What will the 9-year veteran bring to the Seahawks, and how can they maximize his talent at this point of his career? We're going to be breaking it all down here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening down in Salem, Oregon, or over in St. Gallen, Switzerland. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Closing in on a week away from the NFL draft, we're going to take our next look position by position at day 3 wide receivers, some potential diamonds, rounds 4 through 7. And we're also going to take a deep dive into Rob's all defense mock draft on Seahawks.com. A jam-packed episode brought your way by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. The Seahawks have had a lot of fans clamoring for weeks to get offensive linemen with experience, and John Schneider, for numerous occasions, has been outspoken about the fact that the Seahawks were not done adding players there. No, they haven't made any of the splashy moves that I think some fans wanted them to make. Laken Tomlinson finally brings them an established veteran starter to help replace Damian Lewis, at least in the short term. And Rob, this is a player that we had discussed quite a bit in the last few weeks. He had a visit free agency-wise with the Seahawks, and it seemed like, compared to a lot of the other options out there, that this might be the best short-term fit, even with the struggles he had with the Jets last year in 2023. Signs a 1-year contract, and now he would be in the driver's seat, I think, to start at left guard, where he has played the vast majority of his snaps in his NFL career.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I think that this is a very underrated move by the Seahawks, Corbin. I think that Laken Tomlinson is a starting caliber guard that the Seahawks, of course, got deep into free agency, and a relatively cap-friendly deal, been reportedly at $4 million for a guy that basically has been active in 146 out of 147 career games since entering the NFL as a first-round pick. He was a Pro Bowler just a couple of seasons ago for the San Francisco 49ers. And as you just mentioned a moment ago, sir, all of them, basically, all of his starts have been at the left guard position. I think that he is able to kind of just slide right in to a Seahawks front that, frankly, needed somebody with some experience, given the lack of experience that they have everywhere else. I think that this is a huge signing by the Seahawks. I think it gives them ultimate flexibility on draft day. Should a Troy Fautanu or a Taliesin Fuaga happen to fall into their lap? Sure. I still think that you select him, just like if you have a quarterback that you fell in love with. The trade for Sam Howell wouldn't necessarily change that perspective. But now Seattle has the flexibility to be able to go with a defensive player or trade down without worrying that you're going to lose a future Pro Bowl guard, because you already have one now coming in at that left guard position.
There will be plenty of fans out there, Rob, that are going to look at this signing, a mid-April signing off the free agent scrap heap, a player that's 32 years old, coming off what I believe was the worst season in his career, at least when you look at the statistics. Fans are going to look at that. It's not going to inspire a lot of confidence, but I'm going to try to push back a little bit on that. And we've discussed this leading up to this point. The few times we've talked about Laken Tomlinson, that New York Jets offense last year, when Aaron Rodgers went down with a torn Achilles 4 snaps into the season opener and Zach Wilson got thrust back into the lineup, this offense was dysfunctional all the way around. And it really put a lot of strain on the offensive line. And you had Mekhi Becton at left tackle giving up 50 pressures and 12 sacks. The former first-round pick had an awful season. And the left guard, Laken Tomlinson, is having to try to deal with that situation where well, I need to help out my left tackle. And then you have to worry about your rookie center that you've got next to you in Joe Tippmann, who had a decent season, but he still gave up 20 pressures and 3 sacks. This was a line that wasn't coached well. They had a lot of dysfunction, and I think you put a player like Laken Tomlinson, who is better than his numbers he put up last year suggest. It put him in a situation where he simply couldn't be successful. And I think you could say that about this entire offensive line, especially when you have a quarterback behind you in Zach Wilson, who up to this point, he has not been able to handle pressure at all. Some of the pressure that had been put on him by pass rushers is because of his inability to get the football out. It just was not an ideal situation. So I think you can come to the defense of a number of those offensive linemen and say, hey, a change of scenery, just getting out of there, out of that situation should be helpful. And as you mentioned, Tomlinson had 5 really good seasons in San Francisco, and his first year in New York was pretty good. He only gave up 1 sack for the Jets in 2022. You can't tell me that he just fell off a cliff last season the way the numbers suggest. It was a really bad situation for everybody on that offense. But you look at what Tomlinson did in San Francisco. He was a Pro Bowler, as you mentioned, in 2021. But he was one of the catalysts on that offensive line that helped the 49ers consistently be a top 5 to top 7 rushing attack. And he really fit that system well because, ironically, for him being a pretty good drive blocker, he has been as his best in the NFL as a zone blocker, and the numbers bear that out. You look at the Pro Football Focus grades, and again, PFF grades, those are not the end-all, be-all, but I do like to look at the zone versus gap splits. And you look at his 5 years in San Francisco from 2017 to 2021, he never finished worse than 23rd in zone blocking grade. And his last 2 years there, he finished 2nd and 7th in zone blocking grade. When you look at Ryan Grubb's history, Rob, Ryan Grubb up till last year, where he kind of pivoted in Washington, was more of a gap-centric team. He has been a zone-heavy offensive coordinator. He was that way at Fresno State. His first year at Washington, they ran a ton of zone concepts. So this suggests to me that they're going to be leaning back towards that precursor, where up till last year being the exception, that Ryan Grubb's offense was pretty zone heavy. Bringing in somebody like Laken Tomlinson, who has a long track record of being one of the best zone blocking guards in football, would make a ton of sense. And it's telling to me, it's revealing on what type of run game they're expecting to have this year.
Yeah, it definitely suggests more of a zone attack, and I think that fits in really nicely with the running backs that the Seahawks have. Ken Walker III, Zach Charbonnet certainly have a great deal of experience in zone blocking systems going back to their college days, and that to me is one of the real conversations here. And you kind of hinted at this with your comments on the New York Jets, but you focus so much on the quarterback and the fellow offensive lineman, and I think that you just look at a New York Jets team that, as you said, once Aaron Rodgers went down, then there was just a lack of other skill position talent. Obviously a quarterback, but a wide receiver, a tight end as well. And they got a good running back in Breece Hall there. But at the same, and he had a good season this past year. A lot of his best runs actually came off of the left side there. So to me, that is one of the reasons why I have a lot of confidence that we are going to see, at least statistically speaking, Laken Tomlinson be able to have a little bit of a bounce back year, just because the fact that the Seahawks have so much better skill position talent. And that Tomlinson has a great deal of experience blocking along the line of scrimmage with a basically moving parts. And that's what he had at the Jets with the left tackle, as you mentioned, Mekhi Becton, a guy who has struggled with injuries throughout his career, previously played right tackle. So you essentially had a brand new left tackle. You had a brand new center, as you mentioned, in the rookie Joe Tippmann. And so that, to me, considering that Seattle has some consistency at left tackle, of course, in Charles Cross, and you have a center in his second season, presumably going to be the starter, Oluwatimi, at the center position. To me, that type of consistency is something that I think is going to help Laken Tomlinson. And again, just the skill position talent, as well as the scheme fit. All of those things are why I believe Laken Tomlinson is going to be Seattle's starter in the very first game of the 2024 season. And I think that's a good thing for the Seahawks.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the general inexperience on this offensive line, they had one player at the guard spots with more than one regular season start. They absolutely needed to sign somebody that had extensive experience. As you mentioned, well over 100 starts in his career for Laken Tomlinson at left guard. He has played a ton of football at minimum. This is presence that you need for the rest of this offensive line. And if he's able to rekindle some of that play from San Francisco, then you might have a pretty solid starting left guard here in 2024. And you can bring in a young guy the next season, or heck, at 32, maybe Tomlinson still got 3 or 4 good years left in him. Who knows? So this is certainly a signing that I think is a low risk, potentially high reward signing with the experience and the fact that he has been a Pro Bowler in a zone-centric scheme. I'm expecting that's what we're going to see from the run game now in Seattle. Up next, we're going to shift gears. Yesterday, we looked at Rob Rang's all-offensive Seahawks mock draft on Seahawks.com. We're going to look at the all-defensive draft. Which defensive players are joining the Seahawks on this annual all-defense mock draft? We're going to get to that here in a moment on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Locked On Seahawks is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you do if you had an extra hour in your day? For me, I wish I had a bit more time to write and produce heavy metal music. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. And BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs that can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime with no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are closing in on the real deal, the 2024 NFL Draft. And as he does each and every year leading up to the draft, Rob dishing out annual all offense and all defense mock drafts on Seahawks.com. We broke down your all offensive draft yesterday. We're going to do the same thing on the defensive side of the football. And I know in particular the first selection that you made is a player that we have talked about a lot. You and I both believe will be very high on Seattle's big board with that 16th pick or with a potential trade down. And I know you're excited, especially with the fact that Jerzon Johnny Newton had his pro day workout today as well and looks to be fully recovered from a fractured foot.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's going to create a little bit of buzz for him. It seems like everybody else out there seems to think that Byron Murphy II, the defensive tackle from Texas, is somebody for the Seahawks to be keeping an eye on and perhaps will be the very first defensive tackle selected this year. Corbin, for me, look, I like Byron Murphy II, but I just think that Jerzon Newton, who also goes by the name Johnny, but that Newton is clearly defensive tackle number 1 in this draft class. He's certainly the most consistent, a 3-time All Big Ten player. He was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year this past season, led the country with 4 blocked kicks. I can't think of a more individual statistic for a defensive player than that, and has a track record of being able to create significant plays behind the line of scrimmage, whether it be as a pass rusher or against the run. 6'2", 305 pounds. He's not the biggest guy, and so there's going to be some questions about his fit in a traditional 3-4 defense, but I don't think the Seahawks are going to run a traditional 3-4 defense. I think they're going to be multiple like every other club has been over the last several years. We're not in the dinosaur era anymore, and I just think that it comes back down to you want to give Mike McDonald the types of weaponry that is going to allow him to be successful. And John Schneider, for years and now, has gone with the idea that bigs are better. And so that's one of the reasons why if the Seahawks don't go on the offensive side of the ball, they go defensive early on, then I wouldn't be surprised at all if it's going to wind up being either a defensive tackle or an edge rusher who's going to be able to slide down and be able to play some defensive end as well. So right now I have him going Jerzon Newton, number 16 overall. I did not consider any trade down scenarios for this particular mock draft, which, as you said, Corbin, is available at Seahawks.com. Number 81 overall, then. The Seattle's next selection is in the third round, and I have them addressing what I still consider to be their biggest area of concern on defense, and that's at the linebacker position. Jeremiah Trotter, a little bit like Jerzon Newton before. Jeremiah Trotter at 6 foot, 228 pounds. He does not have that classic size that you associate with a three-man defensive line unit. But at the same time, his instincts, in my opinion, are the best of any linebacker in this draft class. His production speaks for itself. The NFL bloodlines speak for themselves. To me, he just checks an awful lot of boxes. I think the Seahawks prioritize the linebacker position even more than size and physicality. He just has an ability to kind of wiggle his way through traffic and be able to create an awful lot of tackles in space as well as in coverage where he is dynamic. 4 interceptions over the last couple of seasons, a couple of those that he returned back for touchdowns. Switching over to the middle rounds, we have the fourth round, where Seattle has 2 selections. As I mentioned before, linebacker is a position of concern. I think the safety is as well. You have a bunch of safeties signed for now, but only I believe it's Rayshawn Jenkins as well as Jarek Reed, who are signed past this upcoming season. So I think that safety is going to be a position the Seahawks look to bring in. One of the safeties that I think looks a lot like what Seattle has prioritized in terms of the traditional free safety looks in the past is Adrian Taylor Demerson. He's got 10 interceptions over the last couple of seasons. He was the fastest safety tested at the combine this year, 4.41 seconds. Corbin just has a different fluidity to him than a lot of the safeties in this class. And if you want to select a safety early on, look, you and I have both gushed about Cooper DeJean. He's one of the handful of safeties I think could be available to Seattle either at number 16 or in the third round. But if you're going to wait until the fourth round for this position, then to me, Adrian Taylor Demerson is one of a few that would make some sense and one of the very, very few that actually has the cover skills to be able to play that free safety role. There's some big box safeties, including a bunch from the Pac-12 that Ryan Grubb is going to know very, very well. But at the same time, if you're looking for a traditional center fielder, DTD is a guy that I think is really interesting. Staying with the secondary, I'm not in love with this cornerback class as a whole. To me, there are 5 corners that are going to go in the first round. We've talked about them before. I think if you want to try and get a corner in the middle rounds, then they're going to have some type of a wart to them. The wart that I see with this next pick, Dwight McLeathern from Arkansas, is that 6'2", 185 pounds. He's kind of slim, and he doesn't play the run with the intensity that I think that most teams are going to prioritize. If the Seahawks can get Reek Woolen to play to the level that he flashed in his rookie season, then I do think that they are going to have some willingness to go with corners who maybe aren't quite as physical, but have good speed, have good awareness, have good hands, and that's something that McLeathern possesses. 8 interceptions over his career. Initially at LSU before he went to Arkansas, had 7 interceptions last couple of seasons with the Razorbacks. So I just love the SEC experience that he possesses. The last couple of picks, just real quick. As I mentioned before with Jerzon Newton, the defensive tackle that isn't really a traditional 3-4 kind of a guy, one of my very favorite 2-gap and defensive linemen in this draft class is Fabian Lovett Sr., a 6'4", 315-pounder with 35.5-inch arms, terrific strength. He was a team captain for a Florida State squad, of course, that was very much in the playoff conversation. I think that he's somebody you might be able to get in that 5th, 6th round. If the Seahawks are lucky and he is available to them with their first pick in the 6th round, to me, he is, again, a nice schematic and locker room fit. Tyrese Knight is another linebacker coming from UTEP. 6'1", 233 pounds. His statistics are through the roof. I mean, this past season, he had 140 tackles, 15.5 for loss, 5 sacks. I mean, the guy is just as explosive upfield as any linebacker in this class, in my opinion. but he also has a willingness to kind of, roam around the field and kind of do his own thing, freelance a little bit. I think that might push him down the board just a little bit. He is somebody the Seahawks have already invested a top 30 visit or 30 visit, if you prefer that terminology. Then finally, Andrew Chatfield. The Seahawks are always going to go with some type of a sleeper. Chatfield is an edge rusher for Oregon State who actually had 9.5 sacks this past year, but was not invited to the combine, which I thought was stunning, frankly. But anyways, 6'2", 250 pounds. He has burst up field. He uses his hands pretty well. This is a former Florida player who basically didn't do much at the college level until this past season when it really mattered. I think is a late 7th round pick. That's exactly the kind of guy you're looking for. Somebody who's got a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. Hopefully somebody that the Seahawks could coax a little bit more pass rush out of them.
I love the first 3 selections in this draft, even though I'm not quite as high on Jeremiah Trotter Jr. as what you are. I think that middle of the 3rd round is probably the sweet spot where he's going to come off the board. And you do have the pedigree, the instincts, the playmaking ability, the pass rushing ability. We know how much Mike Macdonald's going to value that. He's already said as much that every guy in his defense has to be able to blitz. Well, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. is going to be able to do that. And Johnny Newton, he's number 1 DT to me. I like Byron Murphy II, but I don't see the same splash impact plays that Johnny Newton's been making for 3 years at Illinois. And I just think at 305 pounds, he's not a tiny defensive tackle. We're not talking about a 280-pound tweener. This guy has enough beef to be able to play against the best of the best in the NFL. So I like those 2 picks. Dadron Taylor-Demerson is one of my favorite safeties, not named Cooper DeJean. And I think it actually be kind of surprising if he falls into day 3 at this point. I mean, he was the fastest safety at the combine, the interceptions you mentioned. He can tackle. He also had 6 pressures on 6 blitz attempts last year. So Mike Macdonald's going to look at that and say, I might want to do that a little bit more with this guy. So if they don't go with somebody like DeJean early, I could see Taylor Demerson as early as pick 81, quite frankly, being a player that they're looking at. So I really like those 3 selections. And on day 3, I am a big Tyrese Knight fan just because he is truly a ball of moldable clay. As you mentioned, there are a lot of plays that leave you scratching your head when you watch UTEP film. Like, what is he doing? Why is he out of position here? And there are times where he just kind of gets caught in no man's land. But then you turn around and he makes plays like, that looks like a day 2 caliber player. So there's inconsistency. There's some development that needs to happen there. And yet, I think he has as high of a ceiling as any of those day 3 linebackers. He's played off the edge as well. So you're talking about a guy that can play outside linebacker and inside linebacker, and that provides a lot of value on day 3. So those are the picks that really jump out to me on this draft. And I think when you look at the last one that you had as well with Chatfield coming from Oregon State, as you mentioned, in the 7th round, you're just looking for guys that have traits. And you make 9.5 sacks in the Pac-12, now the defunct Pac-12, but still one of the Power 5 conferences that had some really darn good teams last year. To produce those kind of numbers, that showcases the burst and stuff that you're looking for. There are some traits that you can maybe mold into a rotational edge rusher. So overall, quite frankly, Rob, I like this one a little better than your all offensive mock draft. And I think the Seahawks would be really happy if they had to pick all defensive players, and this ended up being the haul they brought in for 2024. Up next, we haven't talked much about wide receivers at this point because, well, quite frankly, the Seahawks, that might be the lowest need on their roster totem pole, so to speak. But we know John Schneider likes to invest late round picks on receivers and look for depth at the position. We're going to talk day 3 receiver prospects to keep an eye on when we return here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by our friends at Game Time. You shouldn't have to start ripping your hair out when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. They get killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. It makes Game Time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets. Recently, I purchased NCAA tournament first and second round tickets for my mother and I in Indianapolis. We were able to get passes for the entire weekend for under $400. $5 a piece via Game Time. We had an absolute blast watching Zach Edey dunk on a bunch of tiny guys. And thanks to Game Time's best price guarantee, it didn't cost an arm and a leg for an experience of a lifetime. Game Time has deals on tickets right at the day of the event, and the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. If you find tickets in the same section row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading Game Time app, creating an account, and using the code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s that are tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks listen fun. We greatly appreciate it. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make sure to switch to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Rob, to this point, we haven't talked much about this year's receivers class, even though it is a very good one. Maybe not the best we've seen in the last few years, but it's still a very good receiver class. And a big part of that is the Seahawks obviously have DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith and Jigba, D. Eskridge, Jake Bobo, Derek Young. They signed a few players in free agency as well. So this looks to be one of the strongest positions, if not the strongest position on Seattle's roster. And yet, we know John Schneider likes to take a roll of the dice on receivers on day 3 and feels you can never have enough depth at that position, especially with the new kickoff rules being put in place as well. And keeping that in mind, there's some really good receivers we could talk about in day 1 and day 2. Maybe the Seahawks shock the world and pick one then, but day 3 would be the sweet spot for John Schneider and company. Let's dive into some receiver prospects, 4th round and later, that could potentially be great fits for the Seahawks. And I know that you have a few players from the Pac-12 that you have some interest in.
I really do. And because Seattle is as deep at the wide receiver position as they currently are, as you mentioned, then that's why I believe that if Seattle is going to be investing a pick in the first 4 rounds at that position, then that had better be a receiver who has some return ability. And so that's what I was kind of focusing in here with the 2 Pac-12 players that I'll be talking about. Starting off with Anthony Gould. I mentioned him in yesterday's show, Corbin, as a player that I think that the Seahawks might be looking at in the 4th round in that offensive-only mock draft. Anthony Gould led all of college football as a punt returner in 2022 for Oregon State, and then he just averaged 15.5 yards per return this past season as well, which actually was a drop from what he did the year before. He didn't have a punt return for a touchdown this past season until the East-West Shrine Bowl, where he had a spectacular return. One of the more impressive plays that I saw throughout the entire All-Star game circuit. He is a small guy. He's 5'8", 174 pounds, but he is absolutely blazing fast. 4.35 seconds in the 40-yard dash. I was at his pro day workout, and he is every bit as quick as he is fast. There's not a lot of guys that do possess both of those traits and have toughness through traffic. That I think that any slot receiver, which I think that is where he projects best, and return man needs to possess. So to me, Gould is how it's pronounced. Anthony Gould is a really interesting player for the Seahawks. And perhaps around that same time, maybe a little bit later, Taj Washington from USC is another wide receiver who has got a similar frame, 5'10", 174 pounds, is not quite as straight line fast, came in at 4.50 seconds in the 40-yard dash, but definitely has terrific quickness and has even more reliable hands. There were times, Corbin, when I was watching his tape that I thought, wow, he reminds me so much of Tyler Lockett, who, of course, has a slight frame, but my goodness, you very rarely see him drop a ball that touches his hands, even if he has defenders draped all over him. That's the way that Taj Washington plays. He was the most productive receiver for presumptive number 1 overall pick, Caleb Williams in USC this past season. And he has the leadership traits that I know the Seahawks prioritize at the wide receiver position as well. So those are two of the receivers that I'm really high on. I know that you're eager to talk about a couple of your guys as well, so I'll switch it over to you as well.
Yeah, you went with Power 5 guys. I've got a couple players from non-Power 5 schools. Now, Tulane has been one of the best programs in the country the last 2 years, and they beat Taj Washington and USC a couple years ago in the Holiday Bowl. And you look at Jaquan Jackson's numbers, never had 1,000 yards, didn't even go over 850 receiving yards in a season at Tulane. So from a statistical standpoint, you might be wondering, where does this guy fit in the NFL? And yet, you look at the fact he averaged 16 yards per catch in his college career. He has big play threat written all over him from the slot and outside. He's a guy that can really take the top off a defense. Legitimate 4.4 speed, a smaller receiver, but he's got the toughness that you're looking for. He actually caught a fair number of contested catches in the middle of the field at Tulane. He ran the football a lot for the Green Wave, so you can mix him in with those jet sweeps. You can play him out of the backfield. And the other thing I love about him is the return capabilities. This is another player that has returned a kickoff for a touchdown in his college career, and that blazing speed and quickness, it shows up on special teams. Jackson had a visit with the Seahawks at the Combine. He is a player that I think will very much be in consideration on day 3 if the Seahawks are going to go with a receiver. Now, on the other end of the spectrum from a size standpoint, Jackson is a smaller receiver, around 5'9", 5'10", 180 pounds soaking wet. But Josh Cephas at UTSA, the same school that Reek Woolen came from, I don't know what they put in the water down there with those Roadrunners, but they got some really big receivers and secondary guys. Josh Cephas, 6'2", almost 200 pounds, had 1,000 yards receiving last year, over 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns. He finished 8th in the country in yards after the catch, so he's a player that can create after the catch. He didn't get a lot of chances on deep balls at UTSA, but he did a lot of damage. He caught 4 touchdowns on 12 targets of 20-plus yards through the air last year. So incredibly efficient with those opportunities. He's another player at that size that has really good athletic tools. You're looking at high 4.4 speed at 6'2", 200 pounds, really soft hands, didn't drop many passes in his career with the Roadrunners. I look at him as potentially being my biggest day 3 sleeper because he's just somebody that isn't getting talked about, but the numbers are there. The film is there. The testing numbers are there. They need another big-bodied receiver with some athleticism for the future on this team. I could see Cephas being a player that the Seahawks are enamored by midway through day 3. One of those 6th-round picks could be a selection for them.
I think it could. And I love the fact that you mentioned Cephas, just the UTSA ties, as you mentioned with Reek Woolen. And I agree. I mean, once you get past DK Metcalf, of course, and, Jackson Smith-Njigba is a fairly big-bodied wide receiver, as is Jake Bobo. And, of course, Laviska Shenault, the one, a free agent that was brought in. But none of them have the type of speed that Cephas possesses. And so to me, he would be an intriguing one. I'll mention another one that I think would really be intriguing. And again, this is by no means a small school. I mean, he played originally at Georgia and then wound up transferring to Alabama, and that's Jermaine Burton. 6'1", 196 pounds, was clocked at 4.38 seconds in the 40-yard dash. I don't know that he plays quite that fast, but one of the things I like about him is I like how angry he plays. I mean, anybody who is willing to transfer from Georgia to Alabama and deal with the crowd, displeasure with that decision, to me, has that kind of chip on your shoulder that I think you have to have, especially at the wide receiver position. And he was a guy that, talk about not having a lot of help in the passing game. The Alabama quarterback, Jalen Milroe, is an unbelievable talent, but he's still very unpolished as a passer, at least was this past season. Let's see what Kalen DeBoer can do with him. But for Burton to come in and become the reliable receiver that he was for an Alabama team, of course, has just spit out first-round wide receivers over the last several years. There wasn't much of a drop-off that we saw this past season in terms of the receiver talent than what we have seen the last several years. And to me, that's really intriguing. Again, to me, he has like a little bit of angry Doug Baldwin in his play. Just the nastiness in which he wants to get after defensive backs. He almost plays receiver like he's a defensive back. And so to me, he is one of the intriguing receivers. He should go in the third round. But I think that there is going to be such a glut of wide receivers this year. You're going to have some really talented wide receivers fall into the fourth round. And that's where I think the Seahawks, with their 2 selections, are really looking forward to plucking one of these wide receivers and basically just getting a steal, because there's just too many for every NFL team to take them all.
One more name that I want to throw out there, and yes, he is related to Christian McCaffrey, but Luke McCaffrey, the receiver from Rice, he actually started his college career at Nebraska as a quarterback, eventually transferred to Rice and moved to wide receiver, and that transition has been really impressive. He went from being a quarterback to being a nearly 1,000-yard receiver at Rice last year, and he also caught 13 touchdowns for the Owls. He clearly could run the football. That was one of his strengths as a quarterback, his ability to run the ball. He has 4.4 speed, a 6.73 cone at the NFL Combine. So he has elite change of direction skills. He is still somewhat unpolished as a route runner, but the jump from his first year as a receiver at Rice to last year was impressive. And you know the DNA. He's got football in his bloodlines. McCaffrey is a guy in the 6th round, if he's still available, that I think could make a lot of sense. And you know that Ryan Grubb likes players that he can move around a little bit. Imagine what you can do with a former quarterback and a guy that's got a running back background in Luke McCaffrey that also could have a very high ceiling at the receiver position. He's also 6'2", so he's not a small guy by any means either. I think McCaffrey, it'd be kind of fun to have the McCaffrey brothers battling twice a year in the NFC West as well. So that would be a side storyline with it. He could be a really fun day 3 player for the Seahawks to consider. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back for our Wednesday show, it's all about the linebackers, one of the most important positions for the Seahawks going into this draft. We're going to look at day 1 and day 2 studs, plus our day 3 sleepers. You won't want to miss it as we draw closer to the 2024 NFL Draft. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.